Ralph Preston, William Lowe, and I are back to do another roadmap. We got asked what are the top things that you would want in your stroke survivor toolkit, and we've done a couple. And tonight we're going to do another one. And this, we each have our own title for this particular topic, but they're the same thing. I call it work what works, and William calls it finding the winning formula. It's really about paying attention to what you're doing and trying to notice the results you're getting or not getting, and then modify from there. So we'll bounce this back and forth a few times. William, why don't you start off with telling us a little bit about what you think is the best way to try and find that winning formula.
Yeah, sure thing. So I've done a lot of thinking in my recovery after stroke, and I've coached a lot of stroke survivors in their recovery as well. And if there's one thing I've learned, or one common trend that I've seen throughout all my experience, which has really separated, the stroke survivors who have gone on to get really good outcomes in their recovery versus those who maybe could have gotten really good outcomes, but for some reason they didn't, is this idea of finding the winning formula. And the reason why I call it finding the winning formula is because in recovery after stroke, one of the things which you've got to remember, which you've got to remember is that our brain primarily recovers from stroke, or neuroplasticity primarily happens in recovery after stroke as a result of what experiences your brain is exposed to, or what experiences your brain is immersed in. In other words, this is what's called experience-dependent plasticity. So in saying that, it's really important in recovery after stroke to do exercises which are created or designed to create a response in your brain, or a brain response. And what this means, and this will be different to everyone, is that you've got to find, and I would encourage you to try to find an exercise which allows your brain, which caters to your brain's preferred way of learning. So for a lot of people, their brain might be more of a hands-on sort of learner, where once they do an exercise or do an activity, then their brain gets it and it dials into the signal. Whereas a lot of other stroke survivors, their brain might be catered a little bit differently, and they might need to do an exercise which gives them a little bit of prompt, a little bit more feedback to get that signal going and allow the brain to wake up some of those signals, which might have been weakened or damaged since they had a stroke. So I think in recovery after stroke, if you can discover that one exercise which your brain is able to learn the best from, that will really do a lot for your recovery and allow you to see more progress. Because once you hit the nail on the head and you found that exercise which caters to your brain's preferred way of learning, whether this be an exercise which gives you that feedback or gives you that extra prompt, or it's an exercise which requires a lot of hands-on activity, then your brain has essentially told you, this is how I learn, and this is how I like to recover after having a stroke. So if you can find more exercises like these, then it's going to be a lot easier to see more changes and progress in your recovery after stroke. And I mean, I'll just list a couple of examples. So for some stroke survivors, it might be that they benefit a lot from electrical stimulation, because the electricity combined with the visual of actually seeing their muscles contract as a machine goes on, that is really good fuel for their brain to help it recover. And other exercises might be actually being able to see the hand relax. So this might be, getting this might be picking up a stress ball, picking up a tennis ball, and being able to see that their fingers relax enough to actually drop the ball, and being able to hear and see the ball actually being dropped into a jar at the same time. So those are just two examples. And obviously each one will cater to to a different person's brain, depending on how their brain likes to learn. So I think that's just really important when it comes to recovery after stroke, because once you find that exercise which caters to your brain's preferred method of learning, then you've essentially found a winning formula which you can rinse and repeat for the rest of your recovery. You just got to find a way to change the exercise which you're doing so that it matches the progress which your brain makes in your recovery after stroke. So that's the first thing. That's the first and most important thing I wanted to start off with when it comes to really finding the winning formula and how it relates to your recovery after stroke. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of making sure that you review and you check what you're doing in your recovery after stroke regularly. And the reason why I say this is because in recovery after stroke, there's no such thing as a magic fix or a silver bullet. So we don't know what works. We don't know what works best in recovery after stroke because everyone's stroke is extremely different. And like I mentioned, the best exercises are the ones which create a response in your brain. And this will be dependent and will vary from person to person. So it's very important to review and check your work. And what I mean by this is that whenever you do a new exercise or whenever you try out a new gadget, whatever, in your recovery after stroke, I highly recommend that the day after, or maybe a couple of weeks after you've done the exercise, that you go back and you have a look to see to see if, let's say you're working on your hand, to see if you can move your hand a lot better, to see if that signal from your brain to your hand is a little bit more automatic than it used to be. For some people, it might be that. I mean, for example, for some of the stroke survivors I coach, and ones who I've helped them with their shoulder, for some of them it might be like someone's put some WD-40 on their shoulder and they're able to move their shoulder a lot better. Mm-hmm. Whereas for other people, it might feel like whenever they walk and they've just done a new exercise, they might find that they're getting into more of a rhythm whenever they're walking, and they're not swaying too much on their non-affected side, and they don't look like they're walking like they're drunk anymore. So I think it's really important to in order to find that winning formula, you've first got to identify which exercises create a response in your brain when it comes to recovery after stroke. Are you more of a hands-on learner where you need to be immersed and I guess get really exposed to just doing the exercise and learning just from doing it? Or are you more, or does your brain learn best more from getting a little bit more prompting or getting a little bit more feedback from the exercise, whether this be electrical stimulation or whether this be actually being able to see your hand or your leg being able to do something which you otherwise could not do. And obviously the other one, and the second most important thing when it comes to finding the winning formula is reviewing and checking your work, making sure that what you're doing is actually getting you results in recovery. And I think this is equally important because a lot of stroke survivors have the tendency of missing the moment in recovery after stroke. And as some of you who are watching this might have heard, you've really got to jump on recovery as it happens, because the train to recovery, it doesn't stop very often. And if you miss that moment where your brain learns something, then it's very likely that it's going to forget it. For example, if you wake up the next morning and you find that you've got a flicker of movement, in other words, you notice that you're able to open your fingers a little bit more, it's important that you jump onto that movement and you try to teach your brain to really dial into that signal of opening your fingers, so that the next morning or the next week, your ability to open your fingers becomes a little bit more automatic. That signal gets a lot stronger, and you're able to make what started off as a really small movement, something like an eighth of an inch, is now turned into a movement where you're able to open up your fingers a lot more, such that you're able to apply it to day-to-day life. So those are my 2 cents when it comes to finding the winning formula. And I know, Ralph, you and I, we've had discussions about this in the past, and you've had moments in your recovery after stroke where you've where you've jumped onto this idea, and I know you call it something different, work what works. Just wondering if you could share your thoughts and experiences on how you came across this in your recovery.
Sure. Um, yeah, I might call it something different, but it's, it's essentially the same thing. Um, I guess, I came home from the rehab hospital in a couple weeks before I got into outpatient rehab, PT and OT. I did have both. So I started right away on day one. So I had a few weeks before I even got to PT and OT. I had my stroke in a small town, went to the big city for 3 weeks, and got released and sent back to the small town. So it's just me around my house. And once I got into PT and OT, I had them as a resource. So I tend to be kind of observant, pay attention to how I'm doing things and what's going on. So instead of basically, I guess, instead of trying out different exercises and seeing what worked, I guess I was trying different exercises and seeing what worked, just as opposed to doing them from a list, doing them from memory and the parts of walking and the parts of moving your hand again as they came to me. So I did get one of those little flickers of movement when they told me to stare at my hands, and I did. I did get a little 1/16 of an inch bump, and it was voluntary movement, and you can build on it. Part of why I use the language "work what works" is so many people. There's a book, a formula. The formula says, first this happens, then this happens, and this happens, and typically tends to go from grosser muscles to finer muscles. So, this is why a lot of stroke survivors learn how to walk again, and some of those who learn how to walk again don't get much back in their hand and arm because those are finer motor skills, finer muscles. So the standard logic says in the book, it says, your shoulder, your arm, elbow, forearm, wrist, and hand in that order. Well, one of the first things I noticed was I couldn't do anything with my shoulder for a long time, but I started getting this movement in my hand. So I would literally wear long sleeves, because otherwise you have to grab the skin, and move my arm around and get it to where I could work what works, which was my hands started working. So I was lucky in the sense I paid attention to it, because I believe it's real important to jump on your recovery. Don't sit around for 3 weeks waiting to get into PT and outpatient PT and OT. Do whatever. I mean, there's things you could do that are wrong, but you really have to work at it. Most movement is good movement. Anytime you do any kind of passive movement with your other hand, moving parts that don't move through the range of motion, or if they want to come up this way, you work against them. So I would encourage people to jump on it as well as work what works. So I always had a plan. I did a hand. I did like 3 different things during the day. I did hand straight OT. I did hand and arm and shoulder, and I did walking. And I did walking every other one. And so I do walking shoulder, walking hand, walking shoulder, walking hand, walking. So and the walking and the shoulder and the hand, I always had a plan. Once I got, some movement going this way, I wanted to make sure my thumb was going to work in opposition. So I started doing opposition. Also started doing thumb push-ups and things. So I always had a plan as to what I would be working on to work towards better hand recovery, more getting some movement in my shoulder, which took forever, and in walking better. but I also remained open to, well, I actually looked for, I'd look to see what was changing every day. You'd think the video guy would have taken videos and reviewed them, but no, I didn't, not ever. I guess I'm 15 years out and I got a smartphone about 6 years ago. So for the first 9 years of my recovery, I had a flip phone. And so I wasn't taking videos. Yeah, I had a big video camera, but it's not the same as setting up a phone and taking a simple video. It's a more complicated proposition. So I never did that. I did use PTs and OTs to mark progress because they see you, once a week, or typically they're gaps. You go home and practice, hopefully. I did, so I get better at something. I go back in, and they were a good way to judge. Mostly I just did it on my own. I took my own little movies every day, and I was aware of whether I was making progress or not. And on the things that I was making progress on, I stayed jumped on. I jumped on them and stayed jumping all over them because I figured if they were working and I was making progress, then those are the type of things that I should be doing. So I didn't have any of the nomenclature, any of the concepts, mass practice. I didn't even hear the word neuroplasticity till 6 or 8 years into my recovery. But somehow or another, just common sense would tell you if something's working, stick with it. So my work what works is very similar. I just came about it rather than like going down the sheets and seeing what worked. I would just made my own program up pretty much from the get-go and paid attention to what worked there and focused on that. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. What other thoughts do you have on finding the best exercises? People aren't always as. How do you know? I mean, I always knew because I pay attention. Always wonder when I give people advice, how are they going to know? I guess success would be one way. Maybe that's why I like work what works. So anyway, I was going to kind of ask you a question, but I didn't. What other thoughts on this subject do you have there, William?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I just want to reiterate everything you said. I mean, everyone's got their own way of going about, what I call finding the winning formula. And I think when you went through your recovery, I just want to highlight or emphasize what you said about, being attentive and really paying attention to what's actually going on in your recovery. Because for those folks who are watching this, recovery is very fleeting, and your brain's not going to remember something for as long as it used to after your stroke, like before you had your stroke. So there's no such thing as set it and forget it. So I think when it comes to recovery after stroke, why I'm being so thorough and why I might be repeating myself so much when it comes to finding the winning formula is because once you find that exercise which creates a response in your brain, you only know that you've gotten the response in the brain if you wake up the next morning or if you take a look a couple of weeks later and you notice that your arm is actually moving a lot better or you're walking a lot better. And on that note, I think that, like Ralph mentioned, it's important to take video and also check with your physical therapist about the progress which you've made, because as a stroke survivor, and I know this myself as well as through clients who I've coached personally, it can be very difficult to see those changes when you're living through this on a day-to-day basis. But someone like your physical therapist if you see them on a weekly basis, they're more likely to see changes for you. And they're able to lead you towards discovering that winning formula which works best for you, because everyone's in a unique situation. Everyone has a different stroke compared to other people. However, what the research says is that the brain responds to particular things in recovery after stroke, which allow it to actually work a lot harder to make changes happen and make those connections or wake up those signals which were lost after stroke. So I think those are my further thoughts on finding the winning formula. I think that if you can really dial into this, be attentive to how you're doing exercises, you know, what feels a little bit easier the next day compared to the last after you've done a new exercise or you've tried a new gadget, then it's going to be really beneficial for your recovery after stroke, because you won't have to go through a bucket list of trying to tick off, different things that you should try, because once you've discovered this winning formula which works for you, you have one exercise which essentially gives you a template of the exercises which are going to cater to your brain's preferred way of learning. So, like I said earlier, maybe your brain learns a lot more from feedback, or maybe it learns a lot more from prompting, or maybe you're a hands-on learner where your brain learns from doing. The sooner you discover how your brain learns, then it's going to be a lot easier in recovery after stroke. If you don't find the winning formula and you don't discover what works for your brain, then you're probably going to have to go through a bucket list of 100 different fancy, funny gadgets to eventually find that thing which works. And I mean, in my own opinion, and I'm sure, Ralph, you have your thoughts on this, I don't think that this is very efficient for time, because there's always going to be an endless list of new things to check out to help you get that boost in recovery after stroke. In my personal experience, I think it's a lot better to find the template which works best for your brain and find other exercises which fall under this template, or replicate this template of how your brain prefers to learn, whether this be through learning by doing or learning through some extra feedback or some prompting, whether this be through an exercise like electrical stimulation, or whether this be through something like being able to see your fingers relax as you're dropping a ball, or releasing your fingers after you've opened the fridge door. I think it's really important to really keep this in mind, because it's going to make recovery a lot easier, and it will remove all the guesswork of trying to find out what is the best way to recover from your stroke. Because your brain has all the tools it needs to recover. And the sooner you find how your brain prefers to learn, it's going to be a lot easier for you to see more changes in your recovery after stroke, because you just have to continue to find exercises which fall under that category of how your brain wants to learn. No, not wants to learn, but prefers to learn. So I know I've repeated myself, multiple times, and I'm doing that because I want to be very thorough, and this is really important, I think, for all stroke survivors to really recognize and really consider in their recovery after stroke. So those are my further thoughts on finding the winning formula. Ralph, just curious, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, which you think the people watching would benefit from?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate it kind of one more time, in the sense that, well, I was having this feeling before you just were talking a minute ago, and you kind of covered it somewhat, but I'll repeat it also. One of the things that both William and I believe is that you can't just pick one exercise and do it forever, because the brain gets lazy. So if you think about this too literally, it kind of sounds like that. But what we're saying is to find out what kinds of exercises work for you, how your brain works, and then one of the things that I tried to do was, however, I'm real visual, so I like to watch. And, when I was talking about, paying attention, I never did the whole hour I did anything with my hand, I was staring at my hand the whole time. I wasn't just sitting there, trying doing something without paying attention to it. Anyway, the point is, once you learn how you learn, then you can maybe apply some of that methodology to other exercises, because as you go through stroke recovery, you're going to go through a medley of various exercises as you get better, and that's how the brain gets challenged. So, um, we're saying find the exercise that works best for you, or work what works. Um, you also have to move on. I know that I never like circled back a week later, because typically if I found something that was working for me, that was that was doing better every day, I did it every day, and I watched the improvement every day. And then when I got to where didn't feel like I was getting any benefit out of it, I found I made it more difficult, or moved on, or asked my OT or PT for something more difficult to challenge it, and then I would go at it the same way that I had learned, the way my brain learned. So, while we say, find what works, work what works, or find the winning formula, we're just really talking about how you learn, as opposed to singling out one exercise and doing that for the next year to get better. Because, as we've talked about before, challenging the brain, mixing it up, um, playing into the way the brain makes blueprints, all have a big effect. And kind of what we've talked about blueprints before, that's kind of what we're talking about now. If you pay attention to the winning formula, or what works, you're kind of playing into how your brain, if you're playing into how your brain learns, then you are just by nature, automatically playing into building a blueprint. So maybe this work what works, find the winning formula is the early scratching around, William, towards learning how to build a more complex blueprint. Never thought about that before, but maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely 100%. I mean, I'm just going to, I'm just going to piggyback on what you said. Definitely with how your brain builds blueprints of how to actually perform things that you used to do before your stroke. Um, Whenever your brain learns something new, what we do know from the research is that your brain creates some scaffolding in the brain of that particular movement. So if you think about piano players, the blueprint in their brain, which is responsible for the hand, it's massive compared to everything else, because they use their hands so much. In recovery after stroke, whenever your brain learns something new, it creates temporary scaffolding. It's kind of like building a structure. And obviously, as you build this structure and it becomes a little bit more developed, you'll need more materials in order to actually create this structure. So what this means in recovery after stroke is that your brain is going to need more fuel to help it to learn how to do something a lot better, so much so that it gets as close as possible to where it was before you had your stroke. So, and this fuel could be like I mentioned, more feedback or more prompting based on how your brain likes to learn, or it could be being more hands-on with the activity which you're doing, actually doing the activity in day-to-day life under a challenging environment where you're under pressure and there's a chance that people might laugh at you, such as holding a glass of water in public, making sure that you don't spill it. So those just so I think as you think about this idea of finding the winning formula, it's really about finding how your brain learns best and finding exercises which cater to this learning, making sure that you continue to mix up these exercises so that they stay consistent with how your brain progresses in its recovery, so that things still remain interesting and your brain doesn't get bored and go on what I like to call autopilot, where it doesn't feel the need to work any harder to make any more improvements because it's already mastered doing something, because you've been doing an exercise for maybe months and months or years on end. So I guess those are my final thoughts when it comes to finding the winning formula. And of course, you can always reach out to Ralph or myself, I mean, we coach stroke survivors, and we can offer a second opinion on how to mix things up to help your brain maybe get that extra fuel it needs to see more changes and progress in your recovery after stroke.
I agree. Happy for anybody to reach out to either one of us. Of course, the best thing in recovery is if you can learn how to do these things for yourself, because you're there all the time, and worked real well for me, I know, and works well for the people I see who are able to kind of bring it in house, so to speak. So, pay attention to what you're doing. Try and learn how to what works for you. What's the winning formula? Mix it up, and we'll see everybody next time soon when we take on yet another one of these toolkit top 10 toolkit items. So see everybody then. Thank you, William.
No worries. Thanks, Ralph.